like that did nothing except kind of boosted Putin's status. Of course, he went off right off to Shanghai right after that and talked about basically that the West's attempt and the U.S. attempt to isolate him had failed. The reality is there was no momentum that really came from that. There was hopes, certainly going into that meeting, and then coming out of it, there was that big meeting in Washington, D.C., and that we had to deal with Russia because it was such a in his mind a great and powerful nation. That basically he had gone out there and established himself in the world scene.
The village of Zelena Dolyna had been quiet for weeks. Nestled among rolling fields and tree lines, it wasn't the kind of place most people outside Ukraine had ever heard of. But in war, even the smallest dot on the map can become the center of the storm.
And of course, the issue is that some of these drones have been flying past Ukraine into Poland. Poland's actually had to shoot down a few drones. And then, of course, the other part, which is you got Russian aircraft, MiG-31s, overflying NATO territory with 7 senior European leaders. And then things just kind of faltered. And here we are. Last night, what you saw was over 600 drones and missiles, mostly drones. Some of them were decoy drones, not actual drones, but they were sent flying into Ukraine. So it's very provocative. In fact, it's about as far off as what anybody could have hoped of during the Alaska meetings. It's the complete opposite in many ways.
That storm came when Russian forces tried to seize it. What they expected to be an easy push turned into one of the most humiliating defeats of the campaign. And when Ukraine hit back, it hit back hard.
Yeah, when we talk about that Alaska meeting, I think you pinned it there perfectly where, this was a big moment for Putin, and really Putin only, because he probably came to Alaska thinking, there's no way I'm even going to get close to ending this thing.
It hasn't really uncovered much territory at all, and they have taken horrendous losses, just unbelievable losses for the amount of terrain that they've gotten. Now, he doesn't want to end it right now. First off, you have to look at the ground. They're in the middle of a kind of a summer offensive. I would say a floundering summer offensive. It hasn't.
The Russian advance. Zelena Dolyna sat near a critical supply route. For Moscow, capturing it meant cutting off Ukrainian logistics and creating a foothold for a wider offensive. Hundreds of Russian troops poured in, backed by armored vehicles, artillery, and drones. Locals fled as shelling lit up the night sky. The Russians dug trenches, raised their flag, and boasted that the area was secured. But Ukraine was watching.
They're getting ready. They're built up a force of about 100 to 150,000 troops. They brought in all this armor and everything else, and they're looking at doing this big fall offensive. So they're going to move from the floundering summer offensive to a fall offensive, and they're going to have this pitched, maybe decisive battle, if you will, that takes place this fall. And I imagine there's going to be a lot of Russian casualties, probably higher than normal, that come in. No, the Ukrainians have also been moving up their defenses. They have a very strong belt up there with there's 3 cities that is just this impregnable Ukrainian defensive belt that are standing in front of them.
The trap. Ukrainian commanders had allowed the Russians to move in, but only so they could be surrounded. Reconnaissance drones circled overhead, mapping every trench, every armored vehicle, every hidden bunker. By the time Russian forces settled in, Ukraine had already drawn up the strike plan. The trap was about to close. The first blow. Before dawn, Ukrainian artillery thundered to life. Precision-guided shells rained down on Russian positions. Trenches that had been dug overnight collapsed in seconds. Vehicles went up in fireballs. Russian soldiers scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. Drone feeds streamed live to Ukrainian artillery crews, correcting every shot, making sure nothing was wasted. By the time the first barrage ended, Russia's so-called stronghold looked like a graveyard of steel. Zelena Dolyna fights back. But Ukraine wasn't done. Infantry units surged forward, moving quickly through the tree lines. Armed with anti-tank weapons and machine guns, they pushed directly into the shattered Russian defenses. Close-quarters battles erupted in the ruins. Ukrainian fighters moved house to house, clearing buildings one by one. Russian soldiers who had once claimed control now found themselves cut off, surrounded, and hunted. Within hours, the fight that Moscow thought it had won turned into a massacre. Russian collapse. Reports from the battlefield painted a grim picture. Some Russian troops abandoned their positions and fled. Others tried to call in reinforcements. only to find that Ukrainian artillery was already targeting the roads. Supply convoys were blown apart before they even reached the front. The once confident Russian advance crumbled into chaos. Commanders lost contact with units. Morale collapsed. Soldiers either surrendered or were wiped out in fierce firefights. By midday, Zelena Dolyna was back under Ukrainian control. The cost of overconfidence. The defeat wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. Russia had poured resources into the push, confident that Ukraine would fold. Instead, Moscow lost hundreds of troops, dozens of vehicles, and its grip on a vital position. Military analysts pointed out the obvious. Russia had underestimated Ukraine again. They treated Zelena Dolyna like a small prize, forgetting that every piece of ground in Ukraine is defended with ferocity. For Ukraine, the victory was more than just reclaiming land. It was a statement. You cannot break us, not here, not anywhere. The global impact. News of the battle spread quickly. In Europe, the victory boosted morale among allies supplying weapons, proof that advanced artillery and drones were making a difference. In Washington, officials cited Zelena Dolyna as an example of why continued support was vital. Every dollar spent, every missile sent, was being put to devastating use. In Moscow, silence. State media barely mentioned the defeat, calling it a temporary withdrawal. But on Russian social channels, videos of burning equipment told the truth. The Russian response. Humiliated, Russia tried to save face. Within 48 hours, airstrikes pounded the region, targeting Ukrainian positions. Missiles streaked across the sky. Explosions rocked nearby villages. But it was too late. The front line had shifted. Ukraine wasn't retreating, it was advancing. Russian commanders ordered reinforcements, but their forces were stretched thin. Too many units had already been chewed up in other battles. Zelena Dolyna was gone, and getting it back would cost blood they couldn't afford to spill. Ukraine's momentum. For Ukrainian soldiers, Zelena Dolyna became a rallying cry. Videos of the battle flooded social media, Russian tanks in flames, Ukrainian flags raised over recaptured ground, soldiers cheering in muddy trenches. It was more than a win, it was momentum. Each victory, no matter how small, stacked pressure on the Russian war machine. And momentum in war can be as deadly as any weapon. The bigger picture. Zelena Dolyna wasn't Kiev or Kharkiv. It wasn't a major city or a famous landmark. But its significance lay in what it represented. Russia had tried to flex its muscles to prove it could still launch offensives deep into Ukrainian territory. Instead, it exposed its weakness. Its troops lacked coordination. Its equipment was vulnerable. Its morale was fragile. Ukraine, on the other hand, showed discipline, patience, and tactical brilliance. They didn't waste resources. They didn't panic. They let the Russians overextend and then crush them. Putin's problem. For Vladimir Putin, defeats like Zelena Dolyna are a nightmare. Every time Russia loses ground, every time its soldiers are forced to retreat, the myth of invincibility cracks a little more. At home, propaganda can only stretch so far. Families notice when sons don't return. Videos of destroyed tanks circulate online despite censorship. Whispers of failure grow louder. And abroad, allies and enemies alike take note. Russia's image as a global military powerhouse fades with every lost battle.